Brent wants to know, I saw your video last week where you said to put thread locker on suspension pivots. Every time I do that, grease from the pivot gets in the thread locker and makes it not work. Do you have a trick for this? I do, Brent. Sometimes assembling suspension pivots can be a real headache, especially pivots that are concentric with the shock mounting bolt. But the main trick here is to prep everything before you start assembling. Before you dive in, inspect your suspension bearings for damage if you haven't already. Pop off the seal with a knife, clean out the old grease and dirt with degreaser followed by WD-40 before repacking the bearing with thick, waterproof grease. Oftentimes you can extend the life of a suspension bearing by running a closed pair of needle nose pliers into the bearing and turning it a few turns. Suspension bearings tend to get stuck in one position because they almost never turn more than 1/8 of a turn at a time. Once it's freed up, the bearings are usually ready to go for another round of abuse. But let's get back to your assembly question. Let's start by taking a look at the type of grease you should be using. You want to use a sticky, thick grease for these components. My favorite for this application is Pro Gold EPX grease. Grease the pivot spindle where it contacts the bearings and frame journals. Make sure that the pivot threads are completely clean and grease-free. The frame's pivot bore also needs to be clean and grease-free. Take your thread locker and apply it to the nut that your pivot bolt will interface with. Applying the thread locker here instead of on the bolt helps keep everything contaminant-free. Now, apply grease to the pivot spacers. You don't have to go crazy with the grease. This is what most people get wrong. With the right type of grease, you only need a little. Put some on both sides of the spacer and then stick it to the bearing. Try not to get any grease on the inside of the spacer. Do the same with the bearing spacer on the other side of the swing arm. Slide the assembly in place and then line everything up. Now use your prep spindle to skewer the whole assembly and then torque the pivot down to the manufacturer's specifications. Let the thread locker cure overnight and you're good to go. If you want your question asked on Ask a Mechanic presented by Cyclery, send your inquiry to webletters@competitorgroup.com.